Well, we welcome you to this very special interview with Supreme Court Justice Daniel Kelly, and I'm glad folks here at Falls Baptist Church have been able to uh, view this and all the others that are joining us for this. This is a very important election, and we're delighted that we have the privilege of having Justice Kelly with us here today, and thank you for taking the time.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for doing this.
Well, you are welcome. I know our people are very much understanding that a judicial race like this has long-term ramifications. So it is wonderful to be able to get to hear from you. Why don't we just start though with just your background. Who is Daniel Kelly?
Sure. So we'll go through the less important stuff real quickly. So I was born in Santa Barbara, California. Don't hold that against me. I did leave. And my family moved to Colorado when I was young. So I did most of my growing up years just in the foothills of the Rockies. So I whiled away my summers fishing the Rocky Mountain streams and lakes, and then the winters skiing. And it was a good time growing up. But I came out to Wisconsin when I was 18 to study at Carroll College in Waukesha. And I have to tell you, it was the most spectacular introduction to a state you could ever possibly imagine. So I fell in love, as it turns out, with the people of Wisconsin the very first day that I was here because of the very first people that I met. The most generous, welcoming folks you can imagine. Met them at a park just at Lake Nagawicca, and they were so welcoming to me and showing me what it is to be a Wisconsinite that I just fell in love with the people of Wisconsin at that point.
So you're married?
Married, so it's just over 30 years now,
great.
And we have 5 children. My oldest is my son Nathaniel. He's 25, and then we have 4 daughters. They're 22, 20, 18, and 13.
Wow.
So they are our gems and just light up our lives. So and that's just been an incredible blessing to us through this time of the campaign. So my wife in particular, she's remarkable in this. So when shortly after law school, maybe 5 years or so later, she said to me once, I think you'd make a good judge. And the folks in the judiciary have always looked up to. These are the people who are especially studied in the law, especially accomplished in the law. And I was grateful that she would think of me in that sense. And so I told her, I said, "Well, thanks, son. I really appreciate that. But I enjoy practicing." Every few years, she would, I think you'd make a good judge. Now, it always came with this caveat, though. She says, "Now, just so you know, I'm not going to be the first lady of anything, and I'm not going to be on commercials, and I'm not going to be standing in front of crowds or any of that. But I will support you behind the scenes." I said, "Okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to do that." Well, now the event comes, and I've got to say, my wife has just been spectacular in this. She said, "You know what? You're not going to do this alone. I am going to be right beside you every step of the way, and it's going to be a family effort." And so we talked to our children about this, and they agreed that this is something they all wanted to be involved in. And so you might have seen one of the commercials that we did. It had my youngest daughter, Anna, was the star of it, and she was quite the star. It was fun to make that commercial. And after we got done, the production crew was telling me, "Dad, she's quite the natural." And I said, "Yeah, she is, isn't she? Isn't that great? She's a real natural at this." And I started thinking, is that something I need to be worried about? Because she really was. But that was a lot of fun. So this is where I come from. It is from a place of family, and I am just incredibly blessed by my wife and our children, and that blessing has just become really manifest as we've gone through this campaign together.
That's great. Well, going from what we'd like to talk about the whole time, your family and background, the matter of judicial philosophy, your view of the Constitution, these are important matters. Not only is it good for our people to hear your perspective, which is really key, but just the importance of this, because this is a lot of our future as a country really rests in our right view of the right philosophy in the legal realm, especially with the judiciary. So whatever you'd like to share here would be tremendous.
Sure. Well, and you're right, Pastor, about the importance of judicial philosophy. This is the heartbeat of what makes a court work, is the judicial philosophy that the members of the court bring to it. And so, I think it's really important that the people of Wisconsin look at that in particular to decide what kind of justice they want on their court. And a judicial philosophy is not complicated. It's just, it's your understanding where the authority comes from that you use, what the nature of the authority is, and how you use that in individual cases. And so I think the best way that I can explain my judicial philosophy is actually in terms of a question that I was asked by a 13-year-old student just a couple of years ago. So we were doing this program, I was doing a presentation, and I told the students I would take questions at the end. And when I was done, this 13-year-old student raised his hand and he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "Who's your boss?" Well, I thought, oh, that's quite a question for a 13-year-old. But it only took me a couple of heartbeats to realize that I had just been asked the greatest question ever. Because this really does get to the very heart of a judicial philosophy. Because we start with the proper relationship between the people of Wisconsin and the governments that they create and maintain. And that question gets to it perfectly, because the answer to that, of course, is that his parents are my boss. And all the rest of the students in that hearing room, I told them their parents are my boss too. And in fact, I went back to him when I found out he was 13. I'd asked him how old he was. I said, "You know what, in 5 years, you're gonna be my boss too."
Yes.
Because that's the way it works here in Wisconsin, all across the United States. All of that authority to create and maintain governments, that belongs to the people of Wisconsin. They own it. So they don't sell it, they don't give it away, they don't alienate it in any other way. And yet, I'm exercising some of their authority. So how does that happen? How does it come to be? If it is their authority, why is it that I'm exercising some of that? Well, I think the answer is that they loan it to me. It's just a loan. They still own it, but they loan it to me through their Constitution, right? So that loan, we document that loan because we want to make sure that no one is going to forget what the terms of the loan are. But we document it in the Constitution. And so every time I look at the Constitution, I understand that there are two important things that I see there every single time I look at it. One, it reminds me that I'm exercising borrowed authority. I'm using it in trust on behalf of the people of Wisconsin. And two, that Constitution tells me there are limits to what I can do. I don't get to do just anything I want just because I'm a Supreme Court justice. Right? So I look at the Constitution and it tells me the people of Wisconsin have commanded me to exercise the judicial power. And that's pretty simple. That's taking the law that already exists, applying it to the case in front of us and coming to our judgment. And that's it. They've not, and specifically, they've not asked us to exercise the legislative power. Right? They committed that to the legislature. So that has pretty serious implications for the work that we do. We don't make up the law. We don't ignore the law. We don't play favorites with the law. We just take the law as it already exists and use that to resolve our cases without respect to our personal politics or personal preferences. And so that's my judicial philosophy. It has to do with who I am in relation to the people of Wisconsin. They're my bosses. I'm their servant. Every single time I put on that black robe, whatever room I'm in, I instantaneously become the least important person in that room. Because when I'm wearing the robe, all I see around me are my bosses. And over this past year, I've been encouraging people to remember who they are as we the people. Right? To remember that they are the ones that own all of the authority, and that they are responsible for how it's exercised by those who occupy governmental offices. And so I've been encouraging them that when they look at the people holding office in government, what they should see there are servants. They're servants. They're not the bosses. They're servants. And so that's been a large part of our campaign as we've gone around the state, is helping them and encouraging them to remember, you are we the people. You are the source of the authority that we exercise. And we're simply the servants as we're exercising that authority.
Justice Kelly, if I may, on the topic here, still in philosophy of the Constitution and your view of it,
Mm-hmm.
I understand there's a couple different ways to look at the Constitution and interpret it, whether we're going to the original meaning of what was written, or whether we're trying to adapt the Constitution to today's philosophies and principles and events.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to your philosophy on that view, how we should view the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. There are two very different schools of thought on how we approach this. So probably the best way to describe my philosophy in that regard is constitutional textualism. And what I mean by that is we're applying the text of the Constitution as it exists, not as we might wish it to be written, but as it has actually been adopted and maintained by the people of Wisconsin, or when we're talking about the United States Constitution, as it was adopted and maintained by the people of the United States. And so when we're looking at that text, what we're trying to find is the original public meaning of the text. Right? So, when these words were written, they were conveying a very specific idea. And as you know, the meaning of words has a tendency to change over time. And so we don't use today's understanding of these words to import back into the Constitution. We're looking for the original public meaning of those words. And that's the way that we can be most faithful to what the Constitution actually requires of us. So that's the way that I approach it. There's a different way of approaching it. There are a number of different labels that travels under, but most commonly it's known as living constitutionalism. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that, well, this is not the 18th century if we're talking about the United States Constitution. It's not the 19th century if we're talking about the Wisconsin Constitution. This is the 21st century. Things are different now. And so, we as justices, somehow this school of thought goes, we have to update the Constitution. And so what they will do is they will import their own preferences into the constitutional text about how they think it ought to be applied today, rather than according to what it actually says. And I think, and that is unfortunately a prevalent idea around the country. Now, fortunately today on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, that's a minority view. Mm-hmm. But it is something to be pushed back against. And here's why. So, as I was discussing what my judicial philosophy is, I started out with the people of Wisconsin with their authority, and then they loan it to us through the Constitution to us. What that in that arrow of responsibility and authority is extraordinarily important because it recognizes these realities. The people control their Constitution, and the Constitution controls us, not vice versa. Right. So I don't control the Constitution, but living constitutionalism would say that the court does. So it puts into the court's hands what the Constitution actually means. And what that does is it robs the people of Wisconsin of the ability to control those who are in office. Because if this branch of government says, I'm not controlled by that document, I can reinterpret it in a way that I think it ought to be rather than the way it actually is, then you're not being controlled by the document anymore. And that means you're not being controlled by the people of Wisconsin anymore. And that is a completely lawless approach to the role of the Supreme Court. So there are those two major schools of thought on how to approach this, but I think only one of them is actually legitimate. And it's the one that respects the fact that the people of Wisconsin have the right and the responsibility of controlling who's in office through their Constitution.
Would you say that this is one of those things that makes you distinct from your opponent?
Yeah, it does. I think as I've gone around the state over this past year, one of the things that has come up is, so how do you differ from your opponent? And when I talk about my opponent, I think it's really important to be accurate in what we say. And so what I've done is I've used her words and her actions to describe who she is. I figure she's the best one to be able to do that. And so I look at what she has said about what she believes the role of the court to be and what her role in it would be. And I look at what she said when she originally came to the judiciary. She's currently a Dane County Circuit Court judge. When she came to that office, she was asked what her primary qualification for the office is. Now, what do you think she might have said? Primary qualification, right? Was it her legal acumen? Was it her prosecutorial experience? Was it her judicial philosophy? It was none of that. She said her primary qualification for the office of the judiciary was her progressive politics. Primary qualification. And then as she's been running for this office, she's been very open about the way she describes what she wants to accomplish on the court as well. So she has said, well, actually more than said, she promised that if she were elected to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, that she would be a social justice warrior on the court. And I look at that and I say, look, that is entirely incompatible with the office of justice, right? So look at it this way. So if you were to walk into a courtroom and you were to see a person on the bench who you just heard out in public talking about the laws that she likes and doesn't like, the causes that she wants to pursue on the court, the specific constituencies she wants to serve on the court. You walk in, you look at your case and you think, well, wait a minute, my case relies on a law that she said that she doesn't like. And you look across the courtroom, there's your opponent, and maybe your opponent is pursuing a cause that the judge said that she does like. And then you consider, well, maybe I'm not part of the constituency that she says she particularly wants to serve. Now, when you walk out of that courtroom, are you going to be confident that your case is going to be decided according to the law? Or do you think the judge's personal politics and preferences are going to direct how she decides that case? And that's the problem that we see in this campaign. So, I take a look at the first television ad that she ran in the campaign. It starts out saying this: it's getting hard these days to tell the difference between politicians and judges. And then within 5 seconds of that, it lists out all of the policy objectives that she wants to accomplish on the court. And I think, well, if it's getting hard to tell the difference between the two, maybe it's because of what you're saying. Maybe it's because your literature talks about all of the policy objectives that you want to achieve on the court. Maybe it's because you say that your primary qualification is your progressive politics. Maybe it's because you promise to pursue social justice causes on the court. Maybe that's why it's getting hard to tell the difference. But that kind of judicial philosophy does blur the difference between politicians and judges, because essentially what it's doing is saying, well, we understand that the legislature is there to pass laws. However, as this philosophy goes, as a justice, I might think that I've got a better way of doing it. Maybe I know better than the legislature does. And so I will impose my views on the legislature. And in essence, you sit as a super legislature so that the people of Wisconsin, they can have their say in the legislature, but then when it gets to the court, maybe they don't have the ability to have their laws upheld anymore, because a judge thinks that she should substitute the law with her personal opinions. So that's the kind of problem I think that we would have with my opponent's philosophy on the court.
Okay. Just if I could follow up a little bit there, I think what you're beginning to talk about now we would call judicial activism. And maybe you could speak to how do you protect yourself? Because I recognize that while a justice, it's important to be nonpartisan, to be fair, to the law. I don't want to answer the question for you, but at the same time, if you're alive and breathing, you have opinions.
That's right.
Okay, so we can't erase ourselves from our experiences and the principles that we were raised with, and all of those things are a wonderful part of who we are. And those are supposed to be brought into play as a justice. How do you protect yourself, though, as you look at something you're deciding from that judicial activism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right. So all of us on the Supreme Court, we all have our beliefs, our opinions, our personal politics. Same is true with all the Court of Appeals judges. Same is true with all circuit court judges.
Right.
The question is, what do you do with those when you put on the black robe, right? and what does it mean to wear the robe in light of the fact that we do have those personal preferences? And I think it is this. So as you put on the robe, you are setting all of that aside. And it's easy to say that. It's a little more difficult to do that in practice. But the way to do it, it requires that you have a personal commitment to it before you come in. And then you have to have a methodology that is designed to reinforce and accomplish that objective. So here's the way that I look at it. So when I decide cases and I write opinions, I start out with the laws that are applicable to the case, and I use rigorous logic to move from those laws down to the conclusion, right? And it's that logic that's essential in this methodology. So once you get done, you should be able to look back and see an unbroken chain of logic connecting the laws to the conclusion. And if you can, if it is unbroken, that is your guarantee that the result of the case is commanded by law rather than by someone's personal opinions. But that's the methodology that you have to use. And if you do that, it will squeeze out all your personal preferences, because as it turns out, logic doesn't care about your politics, right? It simply is. And so that's the way that I approach it. And I try to, and when I write opinions, I try to do it in a way that is just as clear and precise as I can possibly make it. Because I look at the opinions as being my report to the people of Wisconsin about how I've used their authority to decide that case. And so I want them to be able to pick that up, whether they're trained in the law or not, and be confident that they can see how we use their authority to get to that conclusion, so they can say, well, now I know, has he been faithful to the Constitution or has he not? Is he faithfully applying our laws or is he not? And it'll all be right there in the opinion. And so I invite anyone who would like to check my work, to take a look at the opinions I've written, and judge whether I've been a faithful servant in the way that I've handled their responsibilities. Now, I hope that they will take a look at that and will find that I have been a faithful servant. That's been my objective since I was appointed to the court back in 2016.
Part of that is literally for you to defer to the legislature, well over 100 men and women in the state of Wisconsin, plus a governor, all duly elected. Their experiences, their wisdom, just all you're doing is checking that law against the Constitution.
That's exactly right. So you're right, 132 legislators, right? 99 in the Assembly, 33 in the Senate, and the governor. And they're the ones that the people of Wisconsin have asked to use their wisdom and their intelligence and their experience to peer into the murky future and figure out what laws are going to be necessary to promote human flourishing, right? That's what they're set up, and that's what they're set up to do. That's why they have the town halls. That's why they have the regular elections. That's why why people can go in and talk to the legislators and say, this is the law I think that you should be thinking about enacting. And there's all of that constant interaction between the bosses and their servants in that context. Now, when you move to the judiciary, we're not set up that way. You can't come into chambers and say, hey, this is how I think you should decide this case, right? We hear from the two parties, and not even the parties, but their lawyers. And so we're not set up like the legislator is to reflect the people's will as far as what the law ought to be. So that's just another structural clue that we're not supposed to be making policy.
Right.
The policy matters, that's done once the legislature finishes their work. Then we receive the law from them. And you're right, what we do is we compare that to the Constitution, and as long as it is compliant with the Constitution, we apply it.
Right.
And that's true whether we like the law or don't like the law, whether we like the result or we don't like the result. And this is, I think, one of the other reasons why it's so important to have members of the court who are committed to this kind of methodology, who are committed to understanding the limited nature of their authority, because all the cases that we address are the hardest cases in the state, right? So we're a court of discretionary jurisdiction, and that means we don't hear every case that people want us to hear. We get 800-900 requests a year to review cases, but we can only take between 55 and 75 of those cases, so a very, very small percentage. What we're looking for is the hardest cases out there in the entire state, whether constitutional law or statutory common law. We're looking for areas of the law that are unsettled, and we need to bring a definitive word to it. So every day that we walk into chambers, we're looking at nothing but the hardest cases. And that means oftentimes that you are, the conclusion you come to in any given case might be a conclusion that you don't like, right? And that's hard to do. And you have to come to that position with a commitment to just following the law, even when you don't like the result. Because if you don't, what will happen is one day you'll walk in and you'll say, you know what, this case, I'm tired of coming out with conclusions that I don't like. And so today, just today, I'm going to decide this case the way I want to, the way I personally think this result should come out. Not according to what the law requires, but what I personally think it should be. And then you do that and you walk out, you say, you know what, that felt good.
Yeah.
Then the next day you walk in and still nothing but the hardest cases in the entire state on your desk. And it makes it easier the next time to say, you know what, I'm just going to decide this case too, the way I want to. And then over time, what happens is no longer are you following the rule of law, and no longer do we have a government of the rule of law. You have a government that is the rule of judges.
Right.
And you know what, I like my colleagues on the court just fine, but I don't want to be ruled by them. I want to be ruled by law, just like the rest of our fellow Wisconsinites want. And that requires that every day that we come in, we are committed to following the law, even when we don't like the results.
That's good.
That's good.
That's good.
Well, Governor Walker, as you mentioned, appointed you 4 years ago. So that's given you 4 years of experience already on the court. And so you made the decision to run, and you're going through all of this, and it's a 10-year term. What would you say gives you that fire in you to go through all this, to be a Supreme Court justice? Why are you motivated to do it?
Yeah, that's, I think it probably starts a really long time ago, actually. So back in 7th grade, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And that was born of a couple of things, I think. One, I was one of 7 children. And so when there are 7 children, your sense of justice comes into play in a really big way, right? You know, no, this is my space, that's yours, and I want to make sure that I get my, all the rules that make for a smooth functioning family of 7 children. You understand how important that is. But I think on a more serious level, I think I got it from my folks, and they were. I looked up to my folks, of course, as most children do, and I looked at the way they treated us, and they treated us in a just way, and they taught us the importance of justice in the broader community. And as I grew in my education beyond that, I came to understand how essential justice is as a foundational element of society, and how it is that allows us to live together in society in peace and prosperity. If you don't have justice, it doesn't matter how strong the government is. It doesn't matter how smart the legislators are. If you don't have justice, the people will lose confidence in the government. And you will no longer have the ability to have self-governance. You will have simply some version of a tyrannical form of government. So without justice, that's what happens. And so as I grew through my education, I began to prize that sense of justice and the requirement of justice more and more. And so then throughout my practice as an attorney, I mean, I practiced for 25 years before I came to the court, and in all various settings. So I've been in the government sector, I've been in the private sector, for-profit and not-for-profit. I've been a defense counsel, been a special prosecutor. I've litigated contracts and banking and insurance and administrative law and constitutional law and a whole host of other areas of the law before coming to the court. And all of that taught me the absolute essential necessity of justice in our society. And so as I've gone through my career, it was just really kind of a gradual dawning on me of the importance of the potential role that I could play in the judiciary in upholding these principles that have taken us so long to over the history of Western political philosophy. It's taken us so long to develop these institutions and this manner of establishing and administering justice. And there's a passion I have for that has grown over many years. And so when the governor appointed me to the court, I found that this is probably, well, not probably, without question, this is the most satisfying professional thing I've ever done in my life, because it really, it distills the most interesting aspects of the practice of law into one place. So I get to research the law deeply, talk about it comprehensively with my colleagues, and then write about it with precision and clarity. And through all of that, what I hope to accomplish is to help the people of Wisconsin understand the nature of what we do and the application of their laws, and have an ever-growing amount of confidence that justice can be found in our courts and will be found in their individual cases.
Well, before we finish, what would be the final thing you'd like to say to our people? Obviously, you've already given the importance of all of this, but maybe some final words on that and why this election is important and why they need to get out and vote.
Yeah, so I think the first part of that is thanking them for being the best bosses that a guy could have. And I would ask them to, take a look at both my opponent and me, and give a fair judgment on who we are in terms of our judicial philosophy, in terms of our experience, and decide who you think is going to be the best member of the Supreme Court. Now, I do have 4 years of experience on the Supreme Court, and so there's a whole lot of work that I've done. The folks of Wisconsin can go back and take a look at. But I think ultimately, what I would like them to know is how limited this role is, and what kind of what a justice has to bring to the role in terms of understanding who they are in relation to the people of Wisconsin. In that regard, if I could tell just one short story, I was at a Christmas service a couple of years ago. It wasn't our regular church, but my wife knew the pastor's wife, and they'd invited us and some other state office holders to come out and be at the service with them. And so we did. And it was shortly before Christmas, and just a lovely service. And at the end of it, we were out in the foyer talking with some folks, and the pastor came up to greet me. And just a wonderful, gracious man. And he came up to me, he said, "Justice Kelly, thanks so much for coming out to our service. It is great to have someone so important be at our service." And when he said that about being important, my heart dropped. And I said, "Pastor, can we rewind the conversation just a couple of seconds?" So, I've often thought that where you rank is inversely proportional to the number of bosses that you have. Right? So the more bosses you have, the lower your rank. The fewer bosses you have, the higher your rank. I said, "Pastor, how many bosses do you have?" What do you think he said? "He's got one." I said, "Yeah? I got 6 million. So between you and me, you outrank me by a whole heck of a lot." And that's true, right? And that is the way that we need to be relating to the people of Wisconsin. Like I said, every time I put on the robe, I'm the least important person in the room. And so if I could encourage folks watching this, if I could encourage them in anything, find somebody who understands that they're a servant. Find someone who understands that you're the boss, that you have the authority to create and maintain governments, and that those serving you in these positions, they are subject to your authority. And if we can do that, if we can have our government staffed with people who understand that they are servants and they're answerable to their 6 million bosses, then our governmental structure will be sound. Then we'll have wise laws being passed through the legislature. And in regards to this race, they'll be confident that their laws will be upheld along with their Constitution, and that there won't be anyone second guessing their wisdom or the wisdom of their legislators. And I think that's the key point.
Well, thank you, Justice Kelly. I appreciate your thorough answers. I trust you folks have appreciated just the education that you've received, because what you've heard there is the essence of what will keep our country strong by allowing rule of law to dominate rather than many other forces that could be there. So I trust you've taken that in. It wouldn't hurt to rewind it and listen to it again. But thank you for being here. It's been our privilege. And you got to realize that men like Justice Kelly are real people with real families going through the same things we are. And I know that he would very much appreciate your prayer for him. And that God would protect him and his family and give him wisdom in these days ahead. So thank you for joining us. And we're glad we were able to have this time together.
Thanks so much.